Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's session of the comprehensive news analysis, I want to remind you that tomorrow's class in the Target Prelims 2022 crash course that is ongoing on our YouTube channel will be on Indian economy. This is class number 4 of Indian economy and will begin sharp at 7:30 pm. Do join in because in this series we have been discussing important current affairs from the last 365 days of each and every subject. This daily series will go on till 21st of May. It is absolutely free of cost and anyone can join it by coming to our YouTube channel of BYJU'S IAS live at 7:30 pm in the evening. Now let's begin today's analysis with the first article that talks about what is happening in Sri Lanka. Now as you know, India's neighboring island that is Sri Lanka is undergoing one of the toughest crises in its entire independent history. The country is right now going through emergency with huge protests breaking out against the government, specifically the Rajapaksa brothers who hold extremely important positions in the Sri Lankan government, including that of the president and the prime minister. Now, because of the recent protests, the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, that is Rajapaksa Godbaya, has finally resigned and he has been replaced by a new Prime Minister, that is Ranil Wickremesinghe. On the other hand, the protesters are still continuing because they want the president also to resign. The president is also one of the Rajapaksa brothers, that is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but he is still holding on to his position and is not resigning. The entire protest is now focused on him, making him leave his office. In fact, the very famous slogan in Sri Lanka these days is Gota Go Gama. Gama is a local term which means village or home, so it is Gotabaya Go Home. That is what the slogan is across the country right now against the ruling president in Sri Lanka. Now, the article here says that although the media has been covering these protests for the past few months, but the reality is that the protest against the ruling government and against the ruling family had been going on for more than 2 decades now. Just that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, these got much more magnified, and that is how the entire world is now coming to know about it. But this displeasure against the ruling government is very, very old and it is not something that has happened just now. The good part about the ongoing protest is that unlike the other protests in the past, almost every section of the society in Sri Lanka is right now taking part in the protest. It is led by young leaders and they have been inspired by other protests around the world, such as the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the Arab Spring in the Arab nations, Indian Farmers Movement, and the Shaheen Bagh movement in India. All of these have given certain hope to Sri Lanka and its youth, and they believe that by using peaceful protest, they can actually get their way. One of the other groups that are playing a very important part in the ongoing protests is the young lawyers. Now, these young lawyers are helping anyone who is being detained by the police. And because the people also know that there are a lot of young lawyers ready to help them out without charging anything, that is why people also are coming out in large numbers and taking part in this protest, which has made the protest even bigger in the entire country. The only part missing in this protest is that if you look at the northern part of Sri Lanka and the eastern part of Sri Lanka, mainly where the Tamil population resides, in those parts of the country the protest is not that much. Because of which a lot of questions have also been asked from the Tamil population of Sri Lanka, as in, why are you not participating in the protest? Their reaction is that when they were going through a tough time, during the civil war, when the Sri Lankan army, the Sri Lankan government were killing the Tamil population openly, then the majority Sinhalese population did not come to help them out. So now they should not expect that the Tamil population should join in these protests. Although the Rajapaksa brothers were the ones who were mainly responsible for giving these orders, which led to a lot of Tamilians being killed during the deadly civil war in Sri Lanka. That is why, at least among the Tamil population, you don't really see a lot of participation in these protests, except a few. For example, the Jaffna University Students Union, which has a lot of Tamil population, the women in the north, they are the ones who have joined these protests and have started to give these slogans Gota Go Gama. But largely, the Tamil population is still not a part of this ongoing protest across the entire country of Sri Lanka. As I said earlier, now that the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka has resigned and they have a new Prime Minister, the protesters are now demanding the President, that is Gotabaya Rajapaksa, to follow what his brother did and resign from the office. The opposition members also demand that the 19th Amendment of the Constitution should return. Now, I will discuss what is the 19th Amendment in just a bit. Just to give you a very small idea, 19th Amendment of the Sri Lankan Constitution cut down the powers of the Sri Lankan president. Earlier, the Sri Lankan president was allowed to remove the prime minister or the ministers whenever he or she wanted. But with the 19th Amendment, the Sri Lankan president was actually made kind of a ceremonial position just like that of India. That is, the president could only remove the prime minister or the ministers only and only when the government lost the majority and not because he wanted to remove them. This is what the 19th Amendment was. The opposition members want this to return because they don't want President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to remove the Prime Minister whenever he or she wants on his own discretion. The opposition members also demand that after the new government comes in, there should be a special forum set up to take up the economic framework for the IMF negotiations. As you know, the protests in Sri Lanka are more economic rather than political. Yes, they have taken up the shape of a political protest where the people are demanding that the government should change, but the root cause of all this protest is economic. The country is going through huge inflation crisis. The foreign reserves of the country are touching at an all-time low. They have been forced to take multiple loans from the IMF. So the economic policies of the government have ruined the country's economics in a very, very bad manner. And that is why the IMF negotiations have to take place, but the opposition members demand that there should be a new group formed in order to take these negotiations forward. Some experts also say that if the situation does not improve, Sri Lanka might also go towards where Myanmar has gone. That is the military takeover or the military coup. Now, let me tell you a very interesting fact about Sri Lanka. If you look at the size and the population of Sri Lanka, it's not a huge country by either of these two parameters. However, on the other hand, the one thing that Sri Lanka actually has is a huge army. Now, why is it that they have such a huge military and what is the problem with that? See, it is a very common occurrence that whenever there is a nation that goes through problems such as civil war, as Sri Lanka has had in the past, the government usually recruits a lot of people in the army because they want a big army. A lot of people are sacrificing their lives. So whenever you see a small country going through such big problems, they will always have a huge army. Now, the Sri Lankans needed that army in the civil war, but after the war was over, the problem is now you have too big of a military or army for your own good. You have to give them salaries, you have to give them pension, you have to take care of all their requirements. So what happened was, if you look at Sri Lanka in the past couple of decades, a lot of army generals, a lot of people in the higher order in the army were given political positions. Not because they were the best at it, but because the government had to give them some job to do because there were so many people in the army right now. So Sri Lankan army is very, very, very big as compared to what its size is. And that is why there is always a fear that what if the army turns up against the government? What if the army ensures a military coup? Because if that happens, that would be even more troublesome for Sri Lanka. Let me give you an example in terms of numbers so that you can actually understand the problem that I'm talking about. Sri Lanka has an army size of close to 2 lakh. So there are close to 2 lakh armed personnel who are the permanent members of Sri Lankan army. On the other hand, the population of Sri Lanka is again close to 2 crore. It would be 2.1 crore, but let's say for the sake of easier calculation, let's assume the population of Sri Lanka is 2 crore. So it means one army personnel over every 100 people, right? Now let's take an example of India. Indian army has close to 14 lakh soldiers. And how much population do we have? Again, for the sake of easier calculation, let's assume 140 crore. So if you actually see the comparison here, in India, there is one army personnel over every 1,000 people. In Sri Lanka, that is 10 times one army personnel over every 100 people. So see how many army majors and generals are roaming around in Sri Lanka, and that is why there's always a fear that they would also interfere in the government. So that is again a point of view that people are thinking about very, very seriously. I had showed this graph to you earlier as well, but just a reminder that politics in South Asia has always been a dynastic politics. You look at India, you look at Pakistan, Bangladesh, but the dynasty that actually wins hands down is the Sri Lankan dynasty, that is the Rajapaksa dynasty. Now this graph does not even show all the members. There are a lot of other members of the Rajapaksa dynasty who are in the government right now, but just to give you an idea, these are four brothers. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, president. Mahinda Rajapaksa, prime minister, just resigned. Then we have Chamal Rajapaksa, resigned as the irrigation minister. We have the Basil Rajapaksa, who just resigned. He was the finance minister. Son of Chamal Rajapaksa also resigned. That is Shashendra. He was the advanced agriculture minister. Then we had two sons of Mahinda Rajapaksa. One is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, second is the Sports Minister, and there are many other members of the Rajapaksa dynasty in the power at important positions. No wonder that this family is facing a lot of protest in Sri Lanka. Also, in terms of numbers, if you can see how much prices have increased in Sri Lanka of daily stuff that is being consumed in the island. Let's look at the prices of wheat flour and white rice as compared to September 2020 and where the prices have reached in March 2022. The prices have increased by almost 60 to 70% in just an year and a half of the commodities that people consume on a day-to-day basis. So the problem started much earlier as compared to when the protests have been seen in Sri Lanka. Also, as I said earlier, the article makes mention of amendment number 19th. Now, in the news, you would see that the Sri Lankan constitution and its amendments 19th, 20th and 21st have been in the news. Let me explain to you these three constitutional amendments of Sri Lanka. The 19th amendment, as I said, mainly took away the powers of the president to sack the prime minister at his discretion. Now, the president can only remove the prime minister or the ministers on the advice of the prime minister and not without that. Now, the interesting part is that when this amendment was introduced, who was the prime minister? Ranil Wickremesinghe, the same person who has again become the prime minister recently. And he introduced this so that the president could not sack him. So he did it for his own selfish reasons. Political parties are demanding a return of this because this was replaced in 2020 when the Rajapakshas came to power. So the 20th amendment of the Sri Lankan constitution replaced the 19th amendment and gave back the powers to the president in an unprecedented way. It gave a lot of powers to the president, and not just this, it even allowed the dual citizens, that is, people who are Sri Lankan citizens and citizens of other nations, to vote in Sri Lankan elections. One of the reasons why it was did was that a lot of people in the Rajapaksa family are dual citizens, citizens of some other country also, and because they were to be included in the government, that is for this specific purpose this amendment was introduced. So that was a 20th amendment. Then the 21st amendment was to ensure that the 20th amendment actually does not invoke a lot of protest. So 21st amendment again removed several key powers of the president and reduced the position of the president to a ceremonial position just like in India. So right now the president of Sri Lanka is still the commander-in-chief of the three armed forces, but all the other key powers have been transferred to the prime minister now. So this zigzag of power between president and the prime minister is a key feature of Sri Lankan politics in the past decade or so. The next article that we have is about Prime Minister Narendra Modi's demand once again to reform the WHO, that is the World Health Organization. Now this article says that while the demand of the Prime Minister to reform WHO is welcomed and it is something that almost every country in the entire world accepts, but the reason behind this demand may not be good. The reason is that when India's vaccine, that is Covaxin, actually wanted emergency use listing approval from the WHO to be sold to other nations and to be given to the kids, the WHO actually said that we need more time and more data, and we want this data to be submitted to us only and only then we would be able to certify this vaccine for more use. This is what led to the Indian government becoming angry. The Indian government thought that we have conducted enough tests and enough trials have been done and there should not be such a big delay in the WHO allowing the Covaxin to be used on a larger scale. So the article here says that while the WHO is right in doing this, because this is a procedure followed for every vaccine, but the overall demand from the Indian government side that there have to be reforms introduced at the WHO level is absolutely correct. You all would remember that when the pandemic started, the WHO had a long delay and could not even ask China to share the exact data about this virus, which could have been very crucial in the earlier stages and could have saved many lives. If you remember what had happened when the pandemic had started, it was Taiwan that had written to WHO that there is a new kind of a disease that is actually coming up and catching some people, but WHO ignored the warning. In fact, in the initial stages, WHO made a lot of big mistakes. They very famously said that this virus cannot spread from person to person. They even said that nothing wrong is happening in China and they are giving all the possible support that we require. All of that came out to be false, and this outbreak spread throughout the world, killing lakhs and lakhs of people. Maybe if WHO would have been a more powerful body, maybe if they would have had power to put sanctions on China or any other country that is not sharing information, we would not have had this situation as we have right now. One of the other major problems with WHO is that they just don't have enough funds. There is a small portion of money which the member nations must mandatorily contribute. But this mandatory funding does not even make up 25% of WHO's budget. The remaining money that WHO gets is through voluntary donations. Now, the problem with voluntary donations is that the WHO cannot depend on that. For example, let's assume Chinese government gave a lot of money to WHO this year. If WHO tomorrow puts any sanctions on China or speaks against China, China may stop that donation next year because that is voluntary in nature. So why would WHO speak anything against China? That is a problem with voluntary donations. When you make it voluntary on the nations that they may or may not contribute, the organizations such as WHO can never be sure if they would get the money or not. So this is also a major reform that needs to be introduced in the working of the WHO. WHO should also be given the power to impose penalties on the nations for non-compliance. Non-compliance means, let's assume the WHO is asking for certain data from the government, or they're asking the government to take certain action and it has not been taken, then the WHO should be given the power to put penalty on these nations. But again, all these are just reforms and suggestions on the paper which have not been translated into reality. Now, this is not the first time that the Indian government or the Prime Minister has said that reforms are required in the WHO. In fact, in 2020 itself, the Indian government had submitted a 9-point plan to the WHO for introducing reforms. Now, this proposal included similar points. That is, increasing funding, giving more power to WHO, asking WHO to be neutral, etc. So there was no new proposal as such. But just to give you a point-wise version, these are the important and possible reforms that should be introduced in the WHO. First, the WHO should be given the power to impose strong sanctions, especially in case of public health emergencies of international concern. Second, the WHO's mandate, that is, the responsibility given to the WHO, should be clarified and narrowed down. Right now, WHO has a lot of things on its plate and it might not be able to perform all those duties well, especially because they don't have enough money and enough funding. So it should be very, very clear what WHO is supposed to do and they should focus only on that. Third, increase untied funding. As we discussed, the funding is a very, very big problem in WHO. So much so that the entire yearly budget of WHO is lesser than budget of many major US hospitals. Just imagine this. One US hospital having larger budget as compared to the entire budget of the World Health Organization. We discussed earlier as well, the membership fees and the mandatory contribution is just about 20% of WHO's budget. It has to increase if the WHO has to be given more powers. The governance of WHO also should be open. That is, WHO should collaborate with experts from other fields and should be open about any new concern that it has around the world. And lastly, WHO should also ensure that it collaborates with as many experts from different fields as possible, including lawyers, urban designers, political scientists, and take input from all these fields to ensure that they have the best kind of information available. But all of these things are easier said than done because at the end of the day, for each and everything, you require funding. I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say WHO has to collaborate with an international disease expert. Now, when they contact this expert and ask him to work for WHO, this person would obviously say, how much salary would you give me? Do you think WHO will be able to say, sir, we don't have any salary, can you just work for us for free? Obviously, no person would be able to do that. So to engage with experts who travel from one place to other, to research, to publish reports, all of that requires money. And that is why it is so important that WHO has enough resources at their disposal. The next article that we have is an interesting story about the problems in the jute industry in India, specifically in the state of West Bengal, which has most of the jute mills in India. Now, the underlying problem is that in the past few years, a lot of jute mills are closing down in the state of West Bengal and in the state of Bihar. The main reason is that the cost of procuring the raw material is increasing while the government is buying these products at a very low cost, which is actually converting into a loss for these mills. That is why a lot of these mills are being closed down. According to the Indian Jute Mills Association, there are 93 jute mills in India, out of which 70 are in West Bengal only. So about 75% of all the jute mills that we have in India are just in West Bengal. About 3.5 lakh workers work here. However, the problem in these industries mean that a lot of these workers are now out of their jobs in the past couple of years or so. Now, mostly 80% of the finished product, that is the jute bag, the bags in which you see huge amounts of sugar, rice, wheat, etc. being stored, 80% of that is actually bought by the government only to package all this stuff. Now, the problem started in last September mainly. That is when the Ministry of Textiles, through the Office of Jute Commissioner, announced that the maximum price on which we will buy these jute bags from the mills is 6,500 rupees per quintal. Now, this is where the problem lies because the jute industries are saying that the cost for us to make these products of raw jute is actually close to 7,200 rupees per quintal. So, how can the government expect that if we make something for over 7,000 rupees, how can we sell it to the government at 6,500? Do remember, this is not the MSP. MSP is minimum support price. That is a minimum price at which the government will buy. Here it is the MRP. Because the government is the main customer of these mills, the government says that we will buy only at this price. Now, if you can sell it at this price, great. If you can't, then we will go with some other alternative. So here, the monopoly is in the hands of the buyer because the buyer knows that they have the upper hand, which is the government. That is why a lot of mills are actually closing down because they can't take so much of loss every single day. In fact, there are mills that are saying that they are losing lakhs of rupees every single day just by being open. And the result is that lakhs of people are losing out on their livelihood because of these closed jute mills. Now, to resolve this issue in March 2021, there was a tariff commission that was set up that submitted its final report, which said that the prices should increase from the government side. But it has not been implemented. The other fear is that if, let's say, the government does increase the price, there is no compulsion on the government to buy these jute bags. They can always go for some artificial bags which would be much lower in cost, and these mills would again make a lot of loss. So there is no proper solution that is in mind other than the government being ready to pay a higher price in this case. The other problem is also from Bangladesh, which is giving a tough competition to the Bengal jute that we have in India. So much so that the government of India is considering imposing anti-dumping duties against the import of jute products from Bangladesh. That is to ensure that India's jute remains competitive in the market and it is not overshadowed by the jute coming in from Bangladesh. Because of all these problems, India's jute production has been declining over the last decade. This includes decrease in the area where jute is cultivated, because a lot of that is being transferred to paddy, maize, groundnut, sesame, etc. because they are fetching a much higher price as compared to jute. So there are a lot of problems in this jute sector which the government has not been able to solve in the past few years or so. Now let me give you a summarized version of all these problems that we are seeing in the jute industry sector. First, as I said, is the problem of prices. The government is saying that we will only buy maximum at 6,500 rupees per quintal, but the cost of procurement by the mills is much higher. Now the problem here is very unique. The mills that work on the raw jute do not procure raw jute from the farmers because farmers are actually far away and these mills are far away at some other location. So the usual practice is that procurement is done by a middleman who charges the mills for their services. They are the ones who procure the jute from the farmers, they grade them, and then they bring these to the mills, which increases the input cost of these jute mills. Then the other problem is that the cost at which raw jute procurement is being done is very high, and it almost reaches 7,200 rupees. That is also because there is a lot of hoarding that is being done. Then the other problems are the impact of weather. Due to the cyclone Amphan in May 2020, for example, there was a lot of water logging in the large fields. So the crops were not good enough, and that is why the jute production declined, thereby increasing the prices. There's also a problem of a lot of people being dependent on the jute industry for their employment, and that is also something that the government has to look into. Now, some important characteristics about jute that you have to remember is that it requires certain very specific conditions in order to have a good harvest. So it requires a temperature in the range of 25 to 35 degrees Celsius, well drained alluvial soil, and a rainfall from 150 to 250 centimeters only. India is the largest producer of jute, although it has a good competition from Bangladesh and China. In terms of the trade, Bangladesh has taken the lead because it accounts for three-fourths of the global jute exports in comparison to India's only 7%. That is also because India has a lot more internal demand, where the government also uses a lot of it to buy and store these food grains in the Food Corporation of India godowns. Jute, as you know, is known as a golden fiber, and its main application is in making of the gunny bags, which are used for storing these food grains as we just discussed. Some of it is also used in ropes, yarns, carpets, etc. Now, it is not that the government has not taken any initiative from its end. There are some initiatives that the government has taken in the jute sector to give it a push. For example, we have the Jute Fiber Revolution and Technology Mission, under which the government of India is trying to introduce machinery into this industry to lower the cost of labor. We also have the Jute Packaging Materials Act of 1987, under which it has been made compulsory to use jute packaging material for supply and distribution of certain commodities, so that this industry has a constant demand of jute and gunny bags. Then we have the jute geotextiles. The CCEA has approved a technical textiles mission so that it can be applied to the field of civil engineering, soil erosion control, etc. We also have the Jute Smart Mission, launched in December 2016 to promote transparency in the jute sector. It provides a platform for procurement of sacks by the government agencies through the jute mills. So this is what the government has done in the past for jute, but as we can see on the ground, these efforts are not giving the kind of results that the government or the mills had hoped. The next article that we have here is about Turkey saying that it would oppose Finland and Sweden joining NATO. If you remember, yesterday itself we had discussed how there are good chances that Finland and Sweden would apply to become NATO members, and the NATO General Secretary himself has said that NATO will welcome them with open arms. But now the problem is that Turkey, that is itself a NATO member, has said that they would oppose these two nations joining NATO. Now the main reason why Turkey is doing this is Turkey says that Sweden and other Scandinavian nations including Finland have given support to Kurdish militants. Now Kurdish militants are the group of militants who have been fighting against the Turkish government and trying to take away some land of Turkey for many years now. They have been supported by certain European nations including Sweden and Finland. Turkey, on the other hand, considers them as terrorists, while they have been receiving a lot of support from Europe. And Turkey, that is why, is saying that we will not agree to Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Now, as you would know, just like many other international organizations, in NATO also, whenever a new member has to join, each and every existing member has to say yes. Even if one of the members say no, that would be veto. That means a new member would not be able to join unless every existing member says yes. So this can become a problem for Sweden and Finland now. Turkey says that in 1980, when Greece had to be readmitted to NATO, we said yes, but we still regret that decision because Greece has also been indulging in anti-Turkey activities over the past few years. And we would not like to take this chance once again, and we would strictly oppose Finland and Sweden joining the NATO now. Meanwhile, Russia also, as we discussed yesterday, had threatened Finland and Sweden that there would be consequences if they go ahead with the NATO membership request. As a result, Russia is all set to suspend electricity transfer to Finland, which it has been doing under an agreement for a long time now. Although Russia is saying it is because of default payments, but as we all know, the main motive of this is NATO and not the default in the electricity payments. Now, since we have read a lot about NATO in the past few months or so, how NATO works, what is Article 5 of NATO, etc., we should also read about how NATO enlargement works. In other words, what is the process if a new country wants to be a member of NATO? Now, while Article 5 of NATO says that attack against one nation is an attack against all the nations, when you talk about new membership in NATO, that is given in Article number 10. Article number 10 says that parties may, by unanimous agreement, invite other European states in a position to further the principles of this treaty and contribute to the security of North Atlantic area. The government of USA will inform each of the parties of the deposit of such instrument of accession. Now that means number one, each and every country has to say yes, that is, it has to be unanimous. Secondly, it is only open to European states and not non-European countries. So NATO's new membership is only for European countries right now. And that is why it would be interesting to see how Sweden and Finland will become NATO members, because Turkey is opposing this right now. There are examples of this in the past as well. Greece, for example, blocked Macedonia from becoming a NATO member for a long time. Now, there's a very interesting story behind it. Now, Greece as a country has an area called Macedonia. And then there is another country itself which is called Macedonia. So there is one Macedonia inside of Greece, and then there is one Macedonia as a country all alone. In history, you would have read about Alexander of Macedonia. That is the famous ruler Alexander. Now, Alexander of Macedonia belonged to Macedonia, which is inside of Greece and not the Macedonia nation. So Greece for a long time has been demanding that Macedonia, that is the country, should change its name, because people have a lot of confusion that where is Macedonia, where is this great place where Alexander belonged to. So Greece had been demanding Macedonia that you should change your name. Macedonia, on the other hand, obviously did not do that. It was only after Greece told Macedonia that we will not allow you to become a NATO member that Macedonia was forced to change its name. And Macedonia finally changed its name to North Macedonia. That was done because they wanted to become a NATO member. Only when Macedonia country changed their name to North Macedonia did Greece say yes, and North Macedonia became a NATO member. In fact, North Macedonia was the last country to be admitted to NATO till today. So we have examples of how even one single country can stop a new country from becoming a member of NATO. There have been other discussions for NATO membership as well. For example, in 1994 and 95, it was said that only those countries should become NATO members who have the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law followed in their country. So let's see in the coming days if Finland and Sweden get to become a NATO member or not. These were the important articles from today's Hindu newspaper. Now a couple of practice questions. Number one, identify the problems faced by the jute industry in India in the recent past. Suggest ways to overcome these issues. Second, the COVID pandemic brought to light the ineffectiveness of the World Health Organization. In the light of this statement, suggest the reforms needed to make the WHO's working more effective. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.